We're going to get started. Oh, I guess we can get started right now. We are going to turn it over to our speakers in about 4 minutes. But I just wanted to do a quick introduction. Welcome to the California Invasive Species Action Week Lunchtime Talks. My name is Constance Taylor from the California Invasive Plant Council. I am one of the organizers for this week of talks, and we also have Randall Oliver and Julie Clark, who are also organizers for this week of talks. Randall is from the UC statewide IPM program, and then Julie Clark is from the University of California Cooperative Extension. California Invasive Species Action Week is under the direction of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this is a week where we aim to increase public awareness of invasive species issues and promote public engagement in stopping their spread. Events like habitat restoration and invasive plant removal days take place throughout the state from June 1st through June 9th. There's a youth art contest, and for the 7th year in a row, the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources and the California Invasive Plant Council are partnering on these invasive species lunchtime talks. And so they've been taking place from noon to 1 daily from Monday through Friday of this week. Okay, so we are going to get underway with our speakers. We have 2 speakers today who are joining us. We have Dr. Katherine Moseby, who is actually zooming in from Australia. It is 5 a.m. in Australia, so thank you so much, Dr. Moseby, for waking up so early to be here with us today. And we also have Cambria Wells, who is joining us from Los Angeles County. So Dr. Moseby is going to speak first. Dr. Moseby is an associate professor at the University of New South Wales and is a wildlife ecologist and conservation biologist who is passionate about conserving Australia's desert ecosystems. Her research interests include rewilding, mammal behavior, threatened species management, and predator-prey interactions. She aims to improve the plight of threatened species through conducting applied research and applying the learnings to conservation management. Our second speaker, Cambria Wells, is Education and Outreach Manager for California Wildlife Center in Los Angeles County. California Wildlife Center's core work is the rescue and rehabilitation of sick, injured, and orphaned native wildlife, supported by state-of-the-art animal care and rehabilitation facilities, a cadre of professionally trained staff, dedicated volunteers, and an engaged community. More than 170 unique species and upwards of 60,000 patients have been treated by CWC since 1998. So thank you both so much for being here with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Moseby.
Very much. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, good morning. Well, it's good morning for me. Good afternoon for you. Thanks for having me. I wanted to talk to you today about the feral cat in Australia and give you some insights into this animal. Just wanted to give you a heads up. There are some pictures in here of deceased wildlife, so just letting you know that in case that's going to be a problem for anybody. All right, just a little bit about me. I've been working on feral cats for about 30 years and I've worked in the field and as a researcher, so I've got a pretty intimate knowledge of feral cats, coordinated 20 species reintroductions and currently at the University of New South Wales. I don't hate feral cats. I used to have pet cats when I was a child, but I do work a lot on controlling feral cats and sometimes that includes euthanizing them. Feral cats in Australia are a huge issue. We're talking about millions and millions of feral cats, and these are miles away from human habitation, so no direct interaction with humans whatsoever. Far too many to rehome or to do trap, neuter, release on. These are animals that are basically wild and untamed there. Pretty much across all of Australia. They were introduced with the Europeans when they first came in 1788, and they have really helped contribute to the extinction of over 30 mammal species, and there's 100 more that are going down the gurgler right now because of this species. Foxes are another major predator in Australia that's introduced, so it's feral cats and foxes. Between the two of them have wreaked havoc on our native wildlife. Most of my work is in arid and semi-arid areas. So these are sort of the desert areas in Australia, and even though they receive sometimes less than 150 millimetres of rain a year, feral cats are present every square kilometre in this country. So if you walk on the sand dunes in the deserts, one of the first tracks you'll see will be a feral cat. So they really are ubiquitous everywhere in Australia. And 70% of Australia is arid or semi-arid. So this means that, a lot of the feral cats in Australia are in arid and semi-arid areas away from human habitation and human settlement, and really having a huge impact on our native wildlife that are trying to persist in these areas. These are some of the threatened species that are threatened by feral cats. These are some of our native species in Australia, things like the bilby and the sharp-bay bandicoot, the burrowing bettong and the western quoll. All of them have declined by more than 70%, and some of them up to 99%. And a few of them only survive on a couple of offshore islands in Australia, like the sharp-bay bandicoot and the burrowing bettong is only present on 2 or 3 islands now, whereas they used to be present across, most of the mainland. Unfortunately, with the work that I do, we try and reintroduce these animals back into parts of Australia where they're no longer present. And this is what I find on a daily occurrence with my work. And that is animals killed by feral cats almost every time we try and release them back into the wild. So really upsetting for all the researchers and all the conservation volunteers that work on these projects when they continue to find animals being killed by feral cats. And this is the culprit here. They're really similar to domestic cats. They're no bigger, even though there's a lot of people out there say, oh, they're huge. They're not. They're just a normal cat size. They're a bit leaner than a pet cat, but in general, they're you can't tell them apart from a pet cat in terms of their genetics or their size or any of those sort of characteristics. When I think about controlling feral cats, I don't like killing animals or euthanizing things, but when you think about this animal here, which is a numbat, there's less than 1,000 left in the wild, and one of the primary reasons for this is the feral cat. I make a conscious choice to choose Australian wildlife over an introduced species. So that's my personal choice, and not everyone agrees with that, but that's how I justify some of the work that I do. So some of the research we've done on feral cats over the last 30 years shows that life's pretty tough for feral cats in arid Australia. They don't live that long. They're really living less than sort of 5 years, and often less than 4 years. So that's a lot less than, say, a domestic cat, which can live 10 or 15 or even 20 years sometimes. So life is not easy for feral cats in Australia. When it rains and there's lots of prey around, it's great, and then at other times they struggle. They also eat a wide variety of animals. So they eat anything from 0.25 grams up to, a kilo or more. And some of our work has shown that, as the cat gets heavier, the prey that it can eat also gets heavier. So, cats that are large will eat larger prey, which is pretty obvious, but it does mean that some of our larger threatened species are, mostly being targeted by large cats. We've also looked at different ways to control feral cats using things like trapping, and we've found that cats are really neophobic, so they're scared of new things in the environment a lot of the time, feral cats. So often you'll have to have your device, your control device out there for quite a long period before cats will approach it and either get caught or take a bait or whatever it is that you're trying to control them. And we did find as well that our actual research on cats makes them more neophobic. And so you have to leave devices out even longer. But yeah, generally, even up to a couple of months, cats will avoid new things in their environment, including your traps or control methods. We put video collars on cats and looked at how they hunted and how they moved around and what sort of hunting behavior they had. And we found that most of the time cats are sleeping, actually, which no one who has a pet cat will be surprised about. And only about 40% of hunting bouts are successful. So they spend a lot of time hunting, but they, half of the time, at least, they're not successful with that. So they do spend a lot of time resting and a lot of time searching for food, particularly in arid and semi-arid Australia, where life is a bit tougher than other places. One of the main ways we deal with threatened species and feral cats in Australia is with exclusion fencing. So that is building a fence to exclude feral cats and also foxes. We have over 30 of these now across Australia, and we're increasing that number to 40 in the next few years. but they're really small. They only cover about 0.1% of Australia, and they use netting fences with floppy tops and electric wires to keep cats out, and then we reintroduce threatened species into these areas. So this is sort of where they're distributed across Australia. We've got a network of them now. We call them our safe haven network. We also have about 100 islands that we put threatened species on as well that are cat and fox free. So we really rely on these safe havens to exclude cats and foxes and to sort of protect insurance populations of our native wildlife, because in most cases, a lot of these threatened species are no longer found in the wild. They're only found in safe havens or offshore islands. The problem with these safe havens is they're very expensive to construct. They also, animals build up inside, and that can lead to overpopulation and overbrowsing. We get loss of genetic diversity, and we also are really not helping animals learn to cope with feral cats. And one of the reasons they're so destructive in Australia is that our native species didn't co-evolve with feral cats, and they don't really have the appropriate anti-predator behaviour or responses to be able to cope with that type of predator. So a lot of my research is focused on how we can try and get these threatened species beyond the fence and either control cats more effectively or improve the prey responses themselves. So I'm just going to talk quickly about a few of these research programs that we've been trialing. We looked at prey naivety. This is a burrowing bettong. There's a feed tray there. You can see how predator aware he's not. He's just got his head down, and he would be basically lunch for a feral cat without too much trouble. So these are animals that were on islands, and we've now brought them back to try and reintroduce them on the mainland because the mainland populations are extinct. So they're very, predator naive. So one of the things we're trialing is to actually expose these animals to low densities of cats and try and get them to learn how to live with cats, and also accelerate natural selection for traits that might help them live with cats in the long term. And this is obviously a long term, might take 100 years or more for something to happen, but we're just really looking at long-term solutions to these issues. So we did have a large paddock, a 24 square kilometre paddock, which is over 2,000 hectares, and we had populations of these threatened species in there, and we started adding a few cats to try and see if we could change their behaviour and change some of their anti-predator traits. We recorded all these different traits, behavioural and physical traits, on our study animals over about a 10-year period, and we really wanted to see whether we could see any improvements. And we did get improvements, which is amazing and fantastic. We did find that exposing animals to low levels of cats actually improved their survival after a release into other areas. But we did find that most of those improvements in survival were sort of short-lived. So really, in the first sort of few months, they did better, but then overall at the end, they didn't really do any better than the other ones. So it probably suggests that we haven't exposed them long enough to have those types of responses yet. We got some pretty amazing behavioural responses. So this is how close you can get to an animal before it flees. And we found that those that have been exposed to cats, that's the pink ones on the right, you couldn't get very close to them. They would flee very early. Whereas the ones on the left that weren't exposed to cats were like the picture. You could basically go up and almost touch them. So we did find that cat exposure really did help them learn to avoid predators. Interestingly, we also found some natural selection for larger body size, and we think this was because the cats that we put in there were probably eating the smaller animals, and so we were getting animals that were over time getting larger and larger feet and getting bigger and bigger, which is a great thing to be if you're an animal, to try and sort of get large enough so you can't get killed by feral cats. This is a different project that I've been working on where we actually had to control the cats. So I guess the other ones, the excluding cats and the working on prey, that's about trying to sort of protect prey and improve prey responses. And then we also look at ways to basically improve our control of cats, because we do a lot of cat control in Australia, and that involves trapping and shooting and baiting and a whole lot of control measures. And this is a quoll release where we tried to release them outside of a fenced area. And we had really high number that were killed by cats straight after release, despite the fact that we had been trapping and shooting cats in that area for many years. This is the Western quoll. It is probably one of our larger native predators in Australia, about 1 to 2 kilos. So people are surprised that they are actually killed by feral cats. Even though they're aggressive, feral cats still take down this prey. So some of the work we did was we had radio collars on all of our quolls, and we did some DNA genotyping, and we could actually identify the individual cats that were killing the quolls, because we were removing cats constantly from that release area through trapping and shooting, and we were taking their DNA and we could match it to the DNA of the quolls that were being killed by cats. So we wanted to know what sort of cats were actually killing our quolls. And it was really interesting. We found that only certain cats were killing quolls, and these were the large male cats. So quolls are probably on the upper prey size range for cats. So really, we were just seeing these male quolls, male cats that were killing our quolls, and these were the cats that would kill multiple quolls. So they'd kill one quoll, and then they'd start escalating their killing, and they'd get a search image for quolls, and we'd start losing 4 or 5 or 6 quolls to the same cat. We called them catastrophic cats. Also interesting is that these weren't hungry cats. These were cats in really good condition at the sort of prime of their life, and that's why they were able to take down sort of more difficult prey like a quoll. So strong, healthy, large male cats. And then we looked at control methods that we're using to control cats, things like cage trapping and shooting and leg hold traps. And we found that we weren't really catching these problematic cats using our standard techniques. That's the average weight of cats using different techniques. And we found that those large male cats that were doing the killing, the ones that were over 4 kilos, we really had to target them, almost like hunting them down and looking for them specifically, and really trying to target them for control. They were not easy to catch and control using standard techniques. So we did try a range of things. We do use a lot of 1080 baiting in Australia to control both foxes and cats. 1080 baits, I know that they're used in the US as well. They contain fluoroacetate, which comes from gastrolobium plants, and Australia has a lot of gastrolobium plants. So that means that native animals have co-evolved with this fluoroacetate. So most of them have a high level of tolerance to 1080. So it's quite a good poison to use in Australia because it's quite target specific to introduced animals like rabbits and cats and foxes. And this bait here has been developed in Western Australia to target cats by making it kind of a soft, palatable sausage. You can see here there's a bait down the bottom of the screen here, and you can see this cat has just walked past the bait without eating it. And if I show the video, there's another cat that comes and sniffs it, and then a quoll ends up coming and eating it. Now, the quoll is not harmed by those baits because they have a high tolerance to them because they co-evolved, and we had collars on all of our quolls that ate baits, and they were all fine, and they all bred successfully. So that wasn't an issue, but the issue was that a lot of cats just won't take baits in the environment. However, we did go ahead because the quoll population was in real at risk of extinction there. We did go ahead and do our baiting there, and we actually did get quite a good success rate from eradicate baits, which is not always the case. But in areas where there's not much other food around, the cats will take the baits. So we did get quite a good success rate there, and the quoll numbers increased, and they're still surviving 10 years after reintroduction, which is a fantastic outcome. And then we started thinking about how we might be able to target these specialist hunters, these large male cats, these cats that kill multiple animals whilst leaving the other cats alone. And that reduces non-target impact. So rather than putting poison out everywhere in the environment, we can just try and target these particular cats. So we've started developing 2 things, a population protecting implant and a Felix the grooming trap. Population protecting implants, this comes about through the early settlers noticing secondary poisoning. So these are gastrolobian seeds on the left. They're eaten by native wildlife that have a high tolerance to gastrolobium and 1080. And then the cats will eat the pigeons and they die through secondary poisoning. And we started thinking, well, this has worked in the wild, and this is one of the reasons we still have some threatened species in Australia, because they live in areas with lots of gastrolobian plants. And so we started thinking, how can we harness this as well for protecting threatened species? So we've come up with a population protecting implant. It's a tiny little microchip that contains 1080. and it's injected under the skin of prey animals that have a really high tolerance to 1080. So if it ruptures, it's not going to have any effect on that animal at all. And this can be used when we're reintroducing animals to protect them. If a cat eats one, it will dissolve in its stomach, and that cat that is killing your prey will be taken out, and other cats will basically be left alone. So here on the left, you've got a pH 7.4, that's under the skin. It just has no change. The polymer coating stays intact, but as soon as it is ingested and the acidic stomach dissolves the outer coating, then the 1080 or the poison is released, and that kills the cat very quickly. So we've done pen and field trials with this. It's just at proof of concept stage. We found that feral cats will ingest carcasses and die, and bilbies and other threatened species that have PPIs will be totally fine. So we're now moving on to seeing if we can trial this with actual threatened species reintroductions in Australia, and see if we can protect those populations, at least in the early days when they seem to get hammered by feral cats. And finally, this is our other one, the Felix grooming trap. This was invented by my husband, John Reed. It's a device that uses an array of cameras and sensors to detect a feral cat, and then it squirts the poison directly onto the cat's fur, and the cat goes away and grooms and dies. And this sort of relies on the cat's fastidious grooming and compulsive grooming. So it's quite a targeted product. It's 99% target specific, so it doesn't put poison on any other species except feral cats, and it works really efficiently, and it's a good way of ensuring that you don't have non-target impacts. So you can see this is a non-lethal gel that's been sprayed onto this cat here as it walks past. So the cats are just, it doesn't rely on cats eating baits or taking or going into traps or anything like that. So it's like a passive way of controlling them, and they go away and groom and then are euthanized. And this is where we set them in Australia, along fence lines or across roads. They are not triggered with humans or anything like that, and all the poison is contained, which is a lot better than what is currently done in Australia, where millions and millions of 1080 baits are put out all around the place, and with the hope that a feral cat or fox takes one. So this is a big improvement on that, because at least the poison is contained and we have no non-target issues. And we've shown that this will reduce the feral cat population in confined areas by up to 2/3, which is a pretty good if you've got a release site or a reintroduction site, or you're trying to eradicate cats from islands or small areas. Obviously not something we can use over really large areas. And we're also looking at passive ways to control cats. We don't really like going out and killing cats. It's not something I enjoy, or anyone who doesn't enjoy. So we're looking at other ways to control feral cats. And one way is to reduce their primary prey. And in Australia, that is the introduced rabbit. We have millions of rabbits in Australia, and they sustain really high feral cat numbers. So what's happened in Australia was in 1995, the rabbit hemorrhagic disease was released accidentally in Australia, and that led to a massive decline in introduced rabbits out in the environment. So we went from having billions of feral rabbits down to a handful of them. And because that was the cat's primary prey, we also had a huge decline in feral cats just naturally over time, because there was less rabbits, there was less prey, so there was less cats and foxes. And that led to probably the most significant increase in threatened species in Australia's history. These are 4 threatened species. They're little rodents and they're marsupials that live in the arid zone of Australia. And the yellow is the pre-rabbit calicivirus disease distribution, and the blue is the post-rabbit calicivirus distribution. So we saw some threatened species increase their area of occupancy by 70 times just from the release of this rabbit biocontrol virus. So looking at ways to control cat prey has really helped the survival of a lot of our threatened species in arid Australia. So that's been a huge help. And finally, this is my last slide. Another thing, obviously, that is really good to reduce cat impacts is to improve habitat complexity. We have a lot of grazing and overgrazing in Australia, not only by sheep and cattle, but also by native herbivores like kangaroos. And in those areas, they remove the understory and make it a lot easier for cats to hunt, and obviously have that lower land condition as well. So passive things like maintaining your understory, reducing your grazing pressure also helps reduce cat impacts. And that's probably one of the big things that we're pushing in Australia at the moment, because that doesn't involve killing cats directly, but it makes it a lot harder for them to hunt and kill wildlife. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. Hope I didn't go too much over time.
All right, so my name is Cambria Wells. I work at the California Wildlife Center here in Los Angeles County in California. We are a wildlife rehabilitation center, so if you guys aren't familiar with our work, I just want to take you through it real quick. I do want to give the caveat that because I am a wildlife rehabilitator, I come from a very specific position on both feral cats and pet cats. As Dr. Moseby talked about with her work, people are going to have different ethics and positions on how to deal with that, different values for pets and wildlife and for feral cats. So we try to approach everything with an open mind. But I do want to take you guys through what some of the impacts of cats are in our area. And in our area, that compared to Australia, where these damages are really specific to feral cats, here in North America, we do find that although feral cats are responsible for probably about 60% of our bird and mammal losses, pet cats are still responsible for about 40%. That adds up to billions of birds and mammals every year, a lot of them through the kinds of injuries you guys are going to see on my slides today. So similar caveat again to Dr. Moseby, if you are sensitive to some injuries, I will warn you guys before those slides. But we'll go ahead. I call this the worst of both worlds because the situation is bad for wildlife and for cats themselves. So California Wildlife Center, where I work, has been around since 1998. We provide full service veterinary care at no cost to our rescuers. We have about 13 to 16 employees and about 200 active volunteers, depending on the time of year. And we take about 35,000 calls yearly. That's usually the start of a conversation with our rescuers. There are a lot of animals that people are concerned about that may not need to come in, or that may need to go to a different location because they're an exotic or domestic animal. So we usually actually have a conversation by text where we look at a photo of the animal, assess them, see if they need to come into our facility. So those 35,000 calls are really the start of a series of communications with folks. And through that process, we intake about 4,000 animals a year from the public, from vet clinics, and from animal shelters in the greater Los Angeles area. Total, we cover an area of about 10 million people, and a really broad range and complex range of environments. We're what I like to call a generalist facility. So we take nearly all native California wildlife as opposed to some specialist facilities like raptor centers that are very common in our state. We're the only facility in LA County that's permitted for mule deer, fawns, coyotes, and bobcats. We are the only dawn to dusk songbird nursery in LA County, and we are the only facility in California serving both marine mammals and other animals. That's actually really bureaucratically complicated. We have to deal with a number of different agencies for those different kinds of animals, but it's what our community needs. We have 3 departments. We have a marine mammal department that does rescue, rehab, and transportation. Our ICU, that is our sort of the heart of our wildlife hospital, where we intake mostly adult animals that are very frightened of us. And all of our predator species are going to be in that area. So that'll be things like mesopredators, like bobcats and coyotes, as well as things like raptors, birds of prey, adult songbirds, all kinds of other adult animals. And then we have our NICU, our neonatal ICU, where we handle the mostly prey species that need extremely high frequency care. So this room, an animal may be getting fed, cleaned, something similar as often as every 15 minutes on a timer. So a really we have our ICU is our high intensity care, and our NICU is our high frequency care. And we provide a really wide range of different kinds of care. So, classically, when people think of a wildlife hospital, they're going to think of veterinary care, things like exams, medications, wound care. But we also provide really expansive husbandry care that's based off the natural history needs of our patients, what they need to know in order to go back to the wild to perform their techniques for survival. So that might be things like enrichment to teach them how to hunt, enrichment to keep them busy if they're in care with us, actually recovering from an injury, making sure they have the appropriate enclosures, making sure their environment mimics their natural environment. It can be really, really complicated. We try to really talk to people about that because care at home for a wild animal is typically not going to be adequate. We actually have to provide an environment that mimics what they need. And then we have our wildlife hotline where we take those 35,000 calls. Our position as a rescue really makes us an empathetic authority. People will call us in situations where they're otherwise afraid of judgment or afraid for an animal, thinking maybe animal control will euthanize. So it's really important that we provide that service to intervene when an animal doesn't need to come in, or to be available when a person really needs help and doesn't feel like they can talk to someone else. So I wanted to give you guys a picture of what I always find interesting in LA, despite the fact that we have this massive urban wild interface where we have communities that are interspersed with and back up to large amounts of wildland. People tend to have this impression that somehow there's a clean line between our urban environments and our suburban or rural environments and the wild. So, I have our picture here. We've got a nice clean, our houses on the right, our wild animals off in the hills on the left. And of course, I think a lot of people on this call know that this is really what our environment looks more like in LA. We have hills and roads interspersed through urban environments, rural environments. Houses can be positioned anywhere among that. And this makes a really complex environment for a wild animal to grow up in, to persist in, and a really complex environment to try and manage when we're talking to people about how to engage with their wild neighbors. So imagine that in that complex environment, you're a young animal like this fledgling mockingbird. You are filled with spunk, you are very talkative, and since you recently jumped from the nest, your parents have been caring for you on the ground and in low bushes. It's a natural part of your life cycle that you take this risk to learn, to build muscle, and to grow into a fully competent adult. But we as humans have added the incredibly effective predator to your environment that is our domestic cats. And if you're caught by one, you will suffer puncture wounds, lacerations, broken bones, plucked feathers, and more. This little northern mockingbird would only be, maybe 30 grams and unable to actually fly more than a few feet at this stage of life. So he's completely vulnerable. And those injuries can be as hard to see as they are devastating. You can see here the injury on this desert cottontail, our native species of rabbit, is only superficially visible as a wet spot near the shoulder or neck on the left side of this image here. So you can see sort of a spot where there's a little bit of dark fur. When you picked up this animal, that's all you see. But when you actually spread the fur there, you can see this large degloving wound. It actually extends very far over his body. This animal could run and jump. So the only reason often that we have the opportunity to care for cat-caught animals' injuries at our facility is that they are brought home to someone, to an enclosed space by a cat. So if people find an animal in their house, our next question is often whether they own a cat. If for an animal caught by a feral cat, they might not be so lucky. This house finch is in a similar situation. His skin and feathers can really largely cover those wounds when he's resting. So to someone walking by him, it may just look like he's sitting on the ground looking sleepy. Only lifting the wing there on the right side actually shows the extent of the damage. This animal wasn't actually confirmed to have been caught by a cat. This was not brought by someone whose pet had caught it. This one was picked up by a good Samaritan, but it's kind of hard to see here, but in the left image, you can actually see that this house finch is missing a number of his tail and wing feathers. Those plucked feathers and the degloving injuries, as well as sort of very narrow puncture wounds, are clear signs of predation, and they're very typical of cat predation. But it's because of cases like this, where we don't know what caused these injuries for sure, that we're actually unhappy with our ability to actually quantify the effect domestic cats have on our patients. We have many, many more patients where we strongly suggest predation than cases where we have confirmation. That may be because the rescuer doesn't know, or because they're afraid to tell us that their cat did this. And then there's the many, many more patients whose injuries might only be visible as those tiny puncture wounds, and those can be completely hidden under feathers or fur. But they often come to us with presentations that make their distress really obvious. This one in this image is really common for cat-caught hummers. They often have these roused feathers, so they just turn into a little fluff ball. They have closed eyes, heavy breathing, and when you touch them, they often vocalize really loudly. And for such a tiny patient, close assessment can be really difficult, but those might be indications of pain. It's certainly how I interpret them when I'm working with these animals. It's probably the noise I would make if I had a lot of very large puncture wounds into my abdomen and chest. For the patients that do actually escape the cat at first, that don't come to us in the immediate aftermath of their situation, they often come to us in very poor condition as they succumb to their injuries. Under that more wispy fur on this opossum's back are a number of deep infected puncture wounds, and the distal portion of her tail that you can see on the right was stripped of most of its soft tissue. What remained of her tail was devitalized and would need to be amputated. If this animal stabilizes. Because at this point, this is an animal in need of care for life-threatening dehydration, anemia, emaciation, and hypothermia that result from her not getting prompt treatment. And at this point, she was unwilling to walk and could only stand for very short periods of time. Her mentation was really dull, just very weak overall, and absolutely unable to feed or care for herself. These are just a few of the faces of this problem, and of a very wide variety of species just here in LA that are impacted by cat predation. So what do we do for these animals? There's two dimensions of this. There's the treatment routes within our hospital and the conversations we have with rescuers and the public about these cases, because the only way we're going to make progress here is through people changing their minds about the issue. So in the hospital, wound care, fracture management, and other aspects of patient care can be really different, but there's a common denominator in all of our treatment plans for cat-caught patients. That's going to be antibiotics. When possible for our facility, that'll be something called Clavamox. It's highly effective. It's really palatable to patients, as you can see from that little white crowned sparrow's enthusiasm. These guys are great because they'll actually often learn that their meds are sweet and they'll drink them willingly, which is what you can see him doing here. He knows each of these syringes has something nice and sweet inside. But we're not that lucky with a lot of our other patients. We're having to actually force them to take these medications or give them through injection. So he gets there his Clavamox for the infection and Medicam for pain. They'll get those antibiotics for about 1 to 2 weeks or until all their wounds have resolved. For patients like this northern mockingbird who also sustained a fracture there to his tarsometatarsus on his leg that splinted, that means their care will last long enough that they're at our hospital for a minimum of a month, or as long as it takes to resolve their injuries, finish their antibiotics, raise them to young adulthood, move them to an outdoor enclosure to exercise and acclimate to the weather, monitor that they're performing the skills they need to survive in the wild, have learned their species song, and on and on and on. You know, enormous amounts of care and attention are required for these animals to thrive again. And we love to do it, but we would love to never have to do it again. So the question then becomes, when the rescuer whose outdoor cat has brought you 3 baby bunnies this week shows up again, what do you say? Because the best patient is the one that stays in the wild. The first stage here is for me to disclose that I don't fight with people on this. So this is a little image I saved off a long time ago from like a birding memes Facebook page. It says, marked safe from the comments on a wildlife rehabilitator's post about cat predation. If you've ever been on Facebook, you know how difficult these conversations can be, and fighting just hasn't helped. For me, it's not going to change anything. It's going to wear me out, and it may actually stop the person we're talking to from bringing injured animals to us for treatment. This is a hot topic. Some rescuers are angry with a neighbor who feeds a feral cat colony. Some may be doing the feeding themselves. Some may have a beloved indoor-outdoor pet. Their feelings are going to be really disparate, and we have to approach these things very carefully. For us, it can be helpful to remember that we already have evidence that the person who's with us cares, even if it doesn't seem like it from our position. After all, they brought the animal to us, to a wildlife hospital. It's very unusual that our rescuers drive less than about 15 minutes to bring us patients, and some drive for hours. The fact that that person took the time to take the animal, contain it, keep it safe, spend gas money to bring it to us means they care to some extent. And acknowledging that care and effort can open doors to a broader conversation. We try to appreciate cats for what they are. That doesn't mean glossing over the damage that they do, but rather we acknowledge what incredibly effective and persistent predators they can be. I often talk about my old roommate's cat who would steal hot cooking chicken off the stove, and would have terrorized the neighborhood had he been allowed outside. I talk about a colleague of mine who is another wildlife rehabilitator who devotes an enormous amount of her time off to trap, neuter, release, and feral kitten rescue because she has seen firsthand the damage that cats do. Through that process, it gives us time and space to acknowledge the struggle as well of these people, and try to have sympathy for someone whose cat bolts out the door or whose their cat's needs doesn't seem fulfilled by being indoors. By sympathizing with the rescuers' efforts, even if you feel like they've been inadequate so far, you can sympathize as well with the complexity of emotions and practicalities around community cats. You can ask about their specific barriers and therefore offer them specific solutions. For us, that includes referrals to information about indoor enrichment, the outdoor enclosures we call catios, really reputable local rescues to help tackle a large colony, and our own experiences occupying our rambunctious pets or trying to capture a community cat. And when and only when there's some acknowledgement of the idea of bringing a cat indoors, we can evangelize the side benefits of having a spayed or neutered indoor cat. The longer lifespan, the reduction in the risk of disease and injury, and the reduction in the medical bills that come from that disease or injury, and that keeping small wild animals safe from domestic cats in LA actually keeps cats safe from larger wildlife we have in this area, like coyotes. We can talk about how good life is for a cat that we know and how hard life is for a feral or outdoor cat. You want to remember that sometimes this is where people are coming from. This is an actual text we got from someone who dropped off an injured gopher to us. So a little while later that evening, she texted us, "Does this gopher appreciate me saving it? Does he have a brain? Does he know anything?" Um, some folks don't understand animals or understand wildlife, and so this issue doesn't mean anything to them. We are the bridge for these folks to understand, appreciate, and do the right thing for wildlife, if and only if we're a safe place for them to ask questions like this. So our approach is this. Answer the questions, the actual questions of the person you're talking to. Don't lecture them. Acknowledge and respect their position in order to earn their attention and maybe, just maybe, affect change. And in the meantime, we're here as a resource to mitigate the damage that's done. Our rescue work gives us a position of authority, both from scientific knowledge and empathy that's critical to reaching out to our community. People are coming to us because they know we care and we are willing to talk. On an individual and group level, doing that as often as we can is our best tool for a better future for cats and wildlife. That's me.
Excellent. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Cambria. I learned so much from you and from Dr. Moseby's presentation. Thank you both so much for all of your time and compassion and all of the work that you're doing around this topic. We have some questions, and I know it is 12:54, and we are theoretically ending in 6 minutes, but our presenters, both of them, have generously agreed to stay on a little bit longer. So I guess we will start on the questions. Randall or Julie, did you want to read some of them off, or would you like me to?
Sure. No, I'm happy to jump in. Karen asks, to what extent do the past fires also affect the problem with feral cats?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it definitely does have an effect, because when the fires open up the habitat, then the cats will move in and hunt the animals that don't have much cover, and that are also struggling after the fire to find enough food. So yeah, feral cats after fire, and there's some evidence that shows that feral cats are actually attracted to recently burnt ground because it is better hunting habitat for them. So there's certainly a big issue after fires, and those last big bushfires in 2019 in Australia, there was a lot of work done in the aftermath to increase feral cat control in those areas.
Great, thank you. Another question about exclusion enclosures. It's a two-part question. How are the fences secured from the ground level? And secondly, what is the maintenance work and schedule on the maintenance for fencing?
Yeah, so our fences have a foot netting that goes out horizontal to the ground by about 40 centimetres, and that stops animals from digging underneath. And the maintenance is huge, so you have to patrol them at least once a week and fix any issues. And once they get about 20 years old, they start rusting, and then you get holes in the fence and the netting has to be replaced. So it's very, very expensive. Some of these fences are $30,000 Australian per kilometre to build, and they may only last 20 or 30 years before they have to be replaced. So it's a really expensive exercise.
Another question about exclusion fences. Do they inhibit movement of animals that have a wide range?
So it depends on the size of the animal. So the netting is about 30 to 40 millimetres. So small animals can get through, some animals can climb over. But yes, a lot of the larger animals, things like kangaroos or echidnas, can't get through the fence. And that does lead to issues with barriers to dispersal and overpopulation inside and that sort of thing. So yeah, it definitely contributes to that.
This is about the marketing. What is your strategy? How do you convince the public that it is in their best interest to restrict, kill, and remove feral cats when emotion around cats is so high?
Yeah, I think we've been working on feral cats and that message for the last 30 years in Australia, and certainly 30 years ago, it was a lot harder. People have a lot more knowledge now about the impact of feral cats in Australia, and there's actually quite strong public support for control of feral cats now, but that has taken decades of education and awareness, and it culminated in our sort of Threatened Species Commissioner waging a war on feral cats a few years ago that got some sort of international headlines. So the public opinion has definitely swayed now towards being accepting of feral cat control by and large.
Okay. Question about 1080. Is it painful once it's ingested?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about this as well. It's considered an inhumane poison. It's considered to cause severe pain and distress prior to death. That is something that they've been searching for alternate toxins in Australia. There's one called PAP that's being investigated at the moment and used, which is supposed to be a more ethical toxin. So that is definitely something that has been on the radar for quite a long time, and they're looking at other ways to sort of include an analgesic with the bait so that it has an anesthetic as well. So they're certainly looking at what they can add to that to make it more humane. But yeah, it's definitely an issue.
Another 1080 question, which might be a difficult one because it relates strictly to California. And is there a similar substance registered in California that is not harmful to the prey species?
I don't know of anything. I know there are gastrolobium plants in Africa. I think there might be some in America. I'm not 100% sure. There are natural fluoroacetates around the world in different levels, but I know that 1080 in the US has a lot more non-target impacts than it does in Australia because you don't have, as many of these gastrolobium plants. So I'm not aware of another poison that has that native tolerance.
Okay. The next questioner would like some advice about how to deal with urban feral cats that are encroaching upon their property.
I'm not sure who's best to answer that. Maybe that might be you, Cambria.
I can certainly give it a shot. My caveat here is that I am a wildlife rehabilitator, not a, feral cat control specialist. And there's going to be very radically different answers to that problem, just depending on a lot of things about the neighborhood that you're in, why the cats are there, what the environment is. I mean, a lot of the same things that we sort of target when we're doing wildlife exclusion, where we tell people about how to landscape to make the environment unappealing to wildlife, you can kind of do in reverse to make it less appealing for cats, primarily by bringing in coyotes. The presence of coyotes to control feral cats can be really helpful, but that is kind of an aggressive response by some people's standard. Some people don't like the idea of inviting in coyotes to handle that problem. Additionally, depending on the size of the colony, actually capturing and rehoming those animals might be an option, might not. If you have animals that are actually being fed nearby by someone, handling that colony is going to be incredibly difficult to borderline impossible. So these situations are just incredibly complicated. It's very, very difficult. And what you will often find is that within the community, you have two people who want directly opposite things. You have one person who wants to come in and feed the cats and another who wants the cats gone. And those two things can't live together. You have to pick a community solution. So sorry, I know that's not tremendously helpful. These are really, really complex situations, and it really depends on where you're at and who your neighbors are.
Cambria, this next question may
Oh,
be.
actually, Julie, I'm gonna hop in here real quick because it's 1 o'clock. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who showed up. This is the official end of the talk for the day, but we are going to continue on and answer some questions. We do have another presentation on Thursday and another presentation on Friday. Thursday is going to be about fruit flies and quarantine efforts and how they are affecting California's agriculture. Friday is going to be about biological control of invasive star thistle, yellow star thistle. And Julie, I believe, has a link for a survey that she is going to put in the chat. And this is so we can gather some information around your thoughts for today. Really, really appreciate if folks who attend can fill out this survey for this talk. That'd be great. It helps us organize things for presentations in the future. And I think you have put that.
Randall did it. Thank you,
Oh,
Randall.
Randall did it. Great. Excellent. Yes. Okay.
And for those of you, I see several questions coming in through the chat. Just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, but we'll continue with these. I think this next question is somewhat related to the one that Cambria just fielded, and because it has to do with urban suburban settings, and the questioner would like to know, is trap neuter release a viable strategy in these urban suburban settings?
That is going to be hotly contested. It depends on who you ask. It certainly is better than doing nothing. Certainly, at least controlling the size of these colonies is really important. And if that's the strategy that a community is willing to take to do that, and they're willing to employ that on a large scale, that's wonderful. And it certainly is a start. I mean, the ideal is that you want to eliminate that feral cat colony. You want them to go to homes or live out their lives, and for then there not to be a next generation. And unfortunately, in many places, what we do see is that those colonies persist. Even with trap, neuter, and release or rehome. unfortunately, there's just not enough support for the people and organizations that do this, for them to make that broader statewide, nationwide, worldwide impact that they would need to make. So is it certainly part of the strategy? Is it much better than doing nothing? Absolutely. Is it solving our problem as of right now? No. But like I said, like I know people in wildlife rehab who practice trap, neuter, release as well. Like it's better to try, you know.
Cambria, does the Wildlife Center receive feral kittens? And if so, what happens to them?
We do not accept animals that are feral domestics. So that includes things like rock pigeons here in the US are largely actually released domestic breeds of pigeon. So we only take native California wildlife. Unfortunately, we do have a limited capacity for what we can do and what we can help. And so our focus is animals that are native to this area. Feral kittens, if we got a request to help care for them, we would identify that they were not bobcat kittens and refer them to the nearest domestic animal shelter or rescue.
And it looks like another question for you, Cambria. What is the most respectable way to remove feral cats from private lands in California to protect endangered species?
It's definitely going to go back to a similar answer to the one earlier about the feral cats on private property. I mean, respectable lends as well to like an ethical question of what you and your community feel is an appropriate way to engage with domestic animals and animals in general. There are people who feel that shooting them is perfectly respectable. That your ethics may not match with that. I mean, that part of it is definitely a question of communities' feelings about animals and animal welfare. My personal preference as somebody who loves cats and loves wildlife would be if there were all the resources in the world for us to go out, trap every single one of these animals, spay or neuter them, put them somewhere where they had safe sanctuary away from wildlife for the remainder of their life, and slowly reduce the population in captivity over time. But that's not realistic based on the resources that are put toward this issue.
Great. Is there this might be something specific to the states, but is there a sodium nitrate bait for use in feral hog control, which might work for cats? And how are baits kept away from non-target species to prevent the methemoglobinemia?
Yeah, quickly answer that. So, well, in Australia, at least, we are looking at sodium nitrate as a possible bait for cats. And that could go into something like those Felix grooming traps where it's contained and it's kept away from non-target species. But they're just looking at whether that can be produced at a high enough concentration in the gel and whether it can persist long enough in the gel without breaking down and stuff like that. So, yeah, they're definitely looking at that as an alternative in Australia.
What I would just throw out there is that as people are thinking about this has probably already come up for people, but here in California, we have a very similarly sized native cat, the American bobcat. And so that's where when people throw out these things, these solutions are so individual to where you're located and what your species are, because that would almost certainly be a risk to our native bobcats. They're actually using sort of similar strategies to try to treat bobcats for mange here.
Another control method question. How does Felixer target only cats?
Yeah, so the old versions of Felixes used LiDAR. So they used a sort of an outline of using laser, a body shape to recognize the cat. The newest Felixes are using AI cameras to determine. They've been trained to detect, differentiate cats from other species, and they're really, really effective at doing that. We also don't have a lot of other wildlife that has the same shape and looks similar to a cat. Foxes and cats can sometimes be confused, but they're both introduced, so that's not a problem. But as Cambria was saying, in US, you obviously have other predators and things that's an issue for, whereas cats and foxes are really the main sort of medium-sized predator in Australia, and then both not native.
Great. Cambria, questioner would like to know if you're aware of equivalent wildlife centers in Northern California or maybe other states.
Yep. So there's wildlife rehabilitation all over California. In addition to where I work, I'm actually president of California Council for Wildlife Rehabilitators. We have a number of member organizations in Northern California. There's a website on wildlife.ca.gov. That's the California Department of Fish and Wildlife website. They have a page about wildlife rehabilitation, and on that page is a comprehensive list, county by county, of permitted wildlife rehabilitators. Some people are going to be one volunteer working out of their home. Some people are going to be a full-on center. I think they're in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, there's things like Wildlife Center of Silicon Valley, a lot of others up in the north. There's actually a lot more individual centers up in Northern California than there are in Southern California. But I definitely recommend for anybody looking at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's website and being familiar with your local wildlife rehab.
Right. Dr. Moseby, do any native predators in Australia prey on cats?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have the native wedge-tailed eagle that will take cats if they're out during the day or at dawn at dusk. And many people consider the dingo to be native to Australia as well. And the dingo was introduced probably with the Indigenous peoples sort of 10,000 or more years ago. So we consider that to be native. And they do a really good job of controlling feral cats in sort of open areas where the cats can't hide or climb up trees. But in wooded areas or areas where the cats can get away from the dingoes, then they don't have that same effect.
Right. And we have a kind of a semantic question as to when might feral cats be considered an invasive species, or are they already regarded as that?
Well, they are in Australia. They are regarded as an invasive species and a declared pest species, and they're listed as a threatening process for almost 100 threatened species. So I don't know in the US. Someone else might be able to answer that.
There's different declarations in different places. There's different people's opinions of what an invasive species is. We get a lot of interesting ethical questions about that because my facility does not take invasive species, does not take non-native animals, but there are species that are naturalized here, have populations here, and folks can become very frustrated that we don't consider them to be a native animal, despite the fact that they have maybe grown up in the quote-unquote wild here, even if it's an urban environment. So that can be a complicated question. I think, for a lot of us, the question is just, is this an animal that was not here thousands of years ago, whose presence causes measurable damage to the balance of our native environments?
Good. Dr. Moseby, there's a question about what is done with the remains of the cats once they die in the Australian desert.
Yeah, we bury animals just to reduce disease and that sort of stuff. And also if they have died from 1080, just to remove 1080 from the system. It does break down naturally quite quickly anyway, but yeah, that's how we dispose of carcasses.
Good. And this next question is something that I think is more of a discussion between us. The questioner is asking what the link between feral cat problem in Australia and here in California is, and what we're advocating for here in California. And I'd like to start this off by saying the presentation today was to give examples of how feral cat populations are addressed in both Australia and California and the research behind those. But if either of you speakers would like to add any more, feel welcome to jump in.
I mean, I guess in with regard to the question of like what we're advocating for here in California, in the context of my talk and what I'm talking about, I consider my role as a wildlife rehabilitator really to be to share the stories of my patients, share the stories of the people who care about them and who bring them in because they don't like what they see when cats interact with wildlife, and to try and help communities grapple the idea that domestic cats are a problem for the wild animals they care about, and to begin that conversation. I think in some ways it sounds like Australia is a little bit ahead of us in where you guys are at with this conversation. I think for a lot of our communities are only just coming around to the idea of the damage that feral cats, but domestic cats overall, do to birds, mammals, all of these small wild animals that are so near to our homes. And so for me, my goal is to just be here with information and start the conversation.
Yeah, and I would just add that in Australia, there's a lot of focus now on pet cats, and councils are introducing bylaws for things like containing cats on your property, having to have cats in aviaries, outdoor aviaries when they're outside, having to have compulsory desexing and microchipping and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of work now going into the pet cat aspect of work, because we know in Australia that they also produce a lot of damage to our native wildlife as well. So yeah, strengthening those types of laws in California. I don't know what they currently are, but yeah, that sort of containment inside or in outdoor aviaries and stuff like that would be a big step forward.
I did want to just mention that there is a UC Integrated Pest Management Program pest alert on feral cats. So if you go to the UC IPM website, you can find that and see what some of the thinking is in California.
Thank you, Randall. We have one last question, and then we will be wrapping it up. Do you have success getting people to start by keeping their cats indoors during the fledgling season?
That's not really the route we take. One of the problems you're going to have there is that a cat who goes outdoors is not going to be very happy if they're kept inside for just a specific portion of the year. They don't understand why suddenly they're not allowed to go outside. And that doesn't really approach the things that cause people to usually let the cat out, which is concerns about them being engaged. Maybe the cat is peeing inside because they don't have enough to do and they're upset. Additionally, there's plenty of animals that are vulnerable during the winter as well. Fledglings may be especially vulnerable, so we use them as an example. But honestly, there's a species of bird here in California called the common porwheel. They are actually one of the few bird species known to properly hibernate, so they will migrate back to our area. They're present here, but we also get migratory breeding populations, and they will migrate back to our area in winter, kind of buck up in their spot every year and go to sleep for most of the winter. They wake up only on days over certain temperatures to hunt insects. And during that time, they're extremely vulnerable to cats. We get lots of them during the winter cat caught. So we are not advocating well for all of our patients if we only ask people to keep animals inside during fledgling season. We really, for the safety of the cats themselves from coyotes and the safety of all of our native wildlife, we really advocate that cats are either on leash in an aviary or catio, or are given proper enrichment and exercise indoors so that they can be happy there.
Amazing. I think that is all of our questions. Thank you so much, Cambria and Dr. Moseby. This was fantastic. We're getting lots of kudos in the chat saying thank you for a very nuanced and sensitive discussion around this topic. And unless anybody on the panelists or hosts has anything to say, I think we will conclude for the day.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here.
Yes. All right. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody. Bye.